I'm Elizabeth Gray, 30 years old, and I've spent my life proving myself in ways my family never bothered to see. For years, I gave everything, my loyalty, my silence, even my dignity, just to keep the peace at home. But on a flight to Hawaii, when my father laughed out loud, "She's useless. She can't do anything right," something shifted. Hours later, when the engines exploded midair and panic took over, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, humiliated, or underestimated by the very people who should have had your back? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive in, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand tall after being torn down, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about reclaiming your worth. Because what happened next, none of them ever saw coming. The flight to Hawaii was supposed to be a celebration. My parents had booked first-class seats for the whole family, a rare gesture that should have felt generous. Instead, it became another stage for their familiar performance of disappointment. I watched them settle into their leather seats with the practiced ease of people who belonged in expensive spaces, while I fumbled with my carry-on in the aisle. "Move faster," my mother said, not looking up from her magazine. "People are waiting." The overhead bin wouldn't close properly. My bag was wedged at an awkward angle, and every attempt to adjust it made things worse. Behind me, a line of passengers was forming, their impatience growing visible. I could feel my face heating up as I struggled with the latches. "She's useless," my brother muttered from his seat. "Can't even pack right." My father chuckled, the sound carrying further than he probably intended. Some things never change. I finally got the bin closed and slid into my seat, the middle seat, naturally. My parents flanked the window and aisle, leaving me squeezed between them like an afterthought. The airplane was filling up around us, families chatting excitedly about their vacations, couples sharing headphones, business travelers settling in with their laptops. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere. I pulled out my book and tried to disappear. The flight attendant began her safety demonstration, pointing to exits and explaining oxygen mask procedures with the kind of cheerful professionalism that made everything sound routine. I watched her movements, noting the practiced efficiency, the way she scanned the cabin for potential problems. Old habits. My parents ignored the presentation entirely, already deep in conversation about dinner reservations at the resort. "Did you confirm the restaurant for tomorrow night?" my mother asked. "Of course I did," my father replied. "Though I'm not sure why we needed a table for 5. Could have saved money with 4. They weren't trying to be cruel. That was the strange thing about my family. Their casual dismissal of me had become so natural that they didn't even recognize it as meanness anymore. It was just how things were. I was the extra person, the one who tagged along but didn't quite fit. The plane pushed back from the gate, and I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that came with takeoff. Through the small window, I watched the ground crew waving us toward the runway. The engines were spinning up, their sound growing from a whisper to a roar. We rolled forward, gathering speed, and then we were airborne. Hawaii stretched ahead of us, 5 days of beaches and family dinners and carefully orchestrated activities designed to create the appearance of togetherness. I'd been on these trips before. I knew my role. I would smile for photos and stay quiet during conversations and try not to do anything that might embarrass them in front of other tourists. "Did you remember to pack sunscreen?" my mother asked, turning to me for the first time since we'd boarded. "Yes." "The right kind? Not that cheap stuff that doesn't work." "I packed the brand you recommended." She nodded, already losing interest. My father was studying the in-flight magazine, circling activities with a pen. My brother had his earbuds in, eyes closed. The plane climbed steadily through layers of clouds, leaving the mainland behind. I tried to read, but the words kept blurring together. The conversation from the gate kept replaying in my head. "She's useless. Can't even pack right." Small comments, easily dismissed, but they accumulated over time like sediment in still water. Years of similar moments had settled into something heavy and permanent. The thing was, I had packed everything correctly. I always did. I was methodical about preparation, careful about details. I'd learned to be that way out of necessity. When you're constantly told you're incompetent, you develop systems to prove otherwise, at least to yourself. But competence, I discovered, wasn't the point. The point was the role I played in their story about themselves. My parents needed me to be the disappointing daughter so they could feel successful as parents. My brother needed me to be the screw-up so he could be the golden child. I was useful to them precisely because I was, in their eyes, useless at everything else. The flight attendant came by with drinks. My parents ordered wine. My brother got a Coke. I asked for water. Just water, the attendant asked, her professional smile flickering with something that might have been sympathy. Just water. My father glanced over. You could get something else. We're on vacation. Water's fine. He shrugged and returned to his magazine. The gesture said everything, casual indifference, the assumption that my preferences didn't really matter anyway. Why waste energy caring about what I wanted to drink? I sipped my water and looked out the window again. We were flying over open ocean now, the Pacific stretching endlessly in every direction. The water was a deep blue-black, unmarked by ships or islands. It was beautiful and vast and completely empty. I found it oddly comforting. Somewhere below us, 37,000 feet down, fish were swimming through trenches deeper than mountains were tall. Whales were singing songs that traveled for hundreds of miles. Storms were forming and dissipating in patterns too large for any single observer to comprehend. All of it invisible from where we sat, contained in our pressurized tube of recycled air and careful climate control. I'd spent a lot of time thinking about perspective over the years. How the same situation could look completely different depending on where you stood. From my family's point of view, I was the problem child who never quite measured up. From mine, I was someone who'd learned to survive in a system designed to diminish me. The truth, I suspected, was somewhere in between. But I was beginning to think that maybe the truth mattered less than what you decided to do with it. The plane hit a small pocket of turbulence, just enough to make our drinks slosh gently in their cups. My mother gripped the armrest for a moment, then relaxed when the motion smoothed out. Turbulence was normal, expected. The airplane was built to handle much worse than a little atmospheric roughness. Just like people, I thought. We're all built to handle more than we think we can. The question is what happens when we finally find out what that limit actually is. The flight to Hawaii was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it was already becoming something else entirely. I just didn't know it yet. Halfway through the flight, something shifted. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe my father had been building up to this moment since we'd left the ground. Either way, the careful politeness that had kept our family interactions civilized suddenly evaporated. It started with a comment about the resort reservations. My mother was worried about the dinner seating, whether we'd get a good table, whether the restaurant would be too crowded. Normal vacation anxieties that should have been easy to manage. I'm sure it'll be fine, I said. These places are used to handling large parties. My father looked at me like I'd said something profoundly stupid. What would you know about it? You've never organized anything like this. The comment hung in the air between us. A few nearby passengers glanced over, then quickly looked away. This was the kind of family drama that made people uncomfortable on airplanes, too intimate for public consumption, but impossible to escape in the confined space. I was just trying to help, I said. Help. My brother pulled out his earbuds, suddenly interested in the conversation. When have you ever actually helped with anything? My mother made a soft sound of disapproval, but not at him. At me, for creating a situation that required management. Let's not do this here, she said quietly. But my father was already warming up. I could see it in his posture, the way he shifted in his seat to face me more directly. He had an audience now, not just my family, but the other passengers within earshot. And he'd never been able to resist an audience. She's useless, he said, his voice carrying clearly across several rows. She can't do anything right. The words landed like physical blows. Not because they were surprising. I'd heard variations of them my whole life, but because of where we were. Trapped together at 37,000 feet, surrounded by strangers who were now witnessing my humiliation in real time. Laughter followed. Sharp, dismissive laughter from my brother, nervous chuckling from my mother, and then, worst of all, a few snickers from the passengers around us. People who didn't know me, who had no stake in this family dynamic, but who found something amusing in watching a grown woman get torn down by her own relatives. My face burned. Heat spread from my cheeks down my neck, that horrible flush of shame that made me feel like I was glowing with embarrassment. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the airplane floor and fall into the ocean below. Instead, I sat perfectly still and tried to keep breathing. "That's enough," I said quietly. "Is it?" My father's voice had taken on that particular edge it got when he sensed weakness. "Because I don't think it is. I think this is exactly the conversation we should be having. About accountability. About contributing something meaningful instead of just taking up space." More passengers were listening now. I could feel their attention like heat from a fire, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. The woman across the aisle was pretending to read, but her book hadn't moved in several minutes. The man behind me had stopped tapping on his laptop. Even the flight attendants seemed to be giving our section a wider berth than usual. "She's always been like this," my brother added, emboldened by the audience. "Remember when she was supposed to organize Mom's birthday party? Complete disaster." That wasn't how I remembered it. The party had gone fine. People had enjoyed themselves. But facts didn't matter when the story was already written. In their version of events, I was the screw-up, the family member who couldn't be trusted with important responsibilities. "I've tried," my mother said, her voice taking on that martyred tone she used when she wanted sympathy. "God knows I've tried to help her, to give her opportunities to prove herself. But some people just can't handle responsibility." The airplane felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in. The recycled air seemed thinner, harder to breathe. I could hear the engines humming beneath us, carrying us forward over thousands of miles of empty ocean, and all I wanted was to be anywhere else in the world. "You know what the problem is?" my father continued, really hitting his stride now. "She's never had to face consequences. She's always had us to bail her out, to clean up her messes. Maybe it's time she learned what it's like to handle things on her own." I stayed silent, but inside, something was breaking. Not the kind of dramatic shattering you see in movies, but something quieter and more fundamental. A line was being crossed, and I could feel myself stepping over it even as I sat motionless in my seat. They were wrong about almost everything. I'd been handling things on my own for years. I'd built a life they knew almost nothing about, developed skills they'd never bothered to ask about, proven myself in ways they couldn't even imagine. But I'd let them maintain their illusions because it was easier than fighting. Because challenging their narrative would have required energy I didn't want to spend. Now, listening to them perform my inadequacy for an audience of strangers, I realized that my silence hadn't been kindness. It had been cowardice. I'd protected their feelings at the expense of my own dignity, and they'd interpreted that protection as confirmation of their worst assumptions about me. The laughter was dying down now, but the damage was done. I could feel the weight of judgment from the other passengers, the comfortable superiority of people who were grateful not to be in my position. I'd become entertainment for them, a cautionary tale about family dysfunction that they could discuss later with their own relatives. My father settled back in his seat, satisfied. My mother was already pulling out her magazine, ready to move on now that the unpleasantness was over. My brother was putting his earbuds back in, having contributed his part to the performance. They thought it was finished. They thought they'd made their point and could return to the normal rhythm of the flight. But something had changed in those few minutes of public humiliation. Something I couldn't quite name yet, but that I could feel shifting inside me like tectonic plates finding a new arrangement. I looked out the window at the endless ocean below and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: clarity. For the first time in a long time, I knew exactly who I was. And more importantly, I knew exactly who they weren't. The revelation should have felt liberating, but instead it just felt sad. 30 years of letting them define me, 30 years of accepting their version of my story. I'd wasted so much time trying to earn approval from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. But that was about to change. I just didn't know how dramatically. It wasn't always this way. Growing up, I was the overlooked middle child, caught between my older brother's achievements and my younger sister's charm. I was the quiet one who didn't fight back, who learned early that invisibility was safer than attention. When attention came, it was usually the wrong kind. I enlisted at 18, partly to serve my country and partly to escape the suffocating weight of family expectations. The military was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was judged purely on performance. Your background didn't matter, your family's opinion of you was irrelevant. What mattered was whether you could do the job. And I could do the job. Better than most, it turned out. I had a natural aptitude for flying that surprised even me. The instructors noticed it during basic training, the way I understood aircraft systems intuitively, the way I stayed calm under pressure. They recommended me for advanced programs, opportunities that led to more opportunities. Fighter pilot training was brutal. The washout rate was nearly 70%. The physical demands were extreme, but the mental pressure was worse. Every day, instructors looked for reasons to eliminate candidates. They tested your decision-making under stress, your ability to process information quickly, your capacity to function when everything was going wrong at once. I thrived. Not because I was fearless, I was terrified most of the time, but because I'd learned to function despite fear. Years of family dynamics had taught me to compartmentalize, to perform under hostile conditions, to maintain focus when people were actively working to undermine my confidence. The first time I flew solo in a fighter jet, I understood something fundamental about myself. I wasn't the incompetent person my family had convinced me I was. I was someone who could handle complex machinery traveling at 600 miles per hour, someone who could make split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. The contrast with my family's assessment of my capabilities was so stark it was almost funny. Almost, but not quite. Because I was starting to realize how much their opinions had cost me over the years. How many opportunities I'd avoided because I believed I wasn't capable. How many times I'd held myself back because I'd internalized their expectations of failure. But I never told them the details of what I was doing. When I called home from training bases, I kept things vague. Still in the Air Force, I'd say. Still learning to fly. They assumed I had some kind of support role, maybe flying cargo planes or doing routine transport missions. To them, I was still the girl who tripped over her shoelaces in gym class. It was easier that way. Explaining would have required them to fundamentally revise their understanding of who I was, and people don't do that easily. Especially when their identity is built around being the successful ones in the family, the ones who had their lives figured out while their daughter stumbled through hers. My first deployment was to a combat zone. I can't talk about all the specifics, but I can say that flying missions in hostile territory teaches you things about yourself that you never learn in training. You discover reserves of concentration you didn't know you had. You learn to trust your instincts completely because hesitation can be fatal. I was good at it. Better than good. My squadron leader wrote commendations that used words like exceptional and outstanding and natural leadership ability. The same qualities my family had spent years telling me I lacked were the ones that made me excel in one of the most demanding jobs in the world. When I came home on leave, I tried to share some of what I'd experienced. Not the classified parts, just the basic reality of what my life had become. But they couldn't process it. My father changed the subject when I mentioned combat missions. My mother asked if I was getting enough sleep and eating properly, as if I were still a child who couldn't take care of herself. My brother was the worst. He'd graduated from business school and gotten a job at a consulting firm, and he treated my military service like an extended phase I was going through. "When are you going to get a real job?" he asked. "You can't stay in the military forever." I stopped trying to explain after that. It was like speaking a foreign language to people who had no interest in learning it. They'd constructed a version of me that served their psychological needs, and contradictory evidence wasn't going to change that. So I lived two separate lives. In one, I was a decorated fighter pilot who'd earned the respect of peers and superiors through demonstrated competence under extreme conditions. In the other, I was the disappointing daughter who couldn't be trusted with important responsibilities. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. Every family gathering required me to shrink myself back down to their size, to pretend that their assessment of my abilities was accurate. I did it because maintaining family relationships seemed important, because I'd been taught that challenging their narrative was selfish and destructive. But sitting on that airplane, listening to them perform my inadequacy for strangers, I realized that I'd been protecting the wrong thing. I'd been so concerned with keeping the peace that I'd sacrificed my own dignity. I'd let them define me for so long that I'd almost forgotten who I really was. The woman next to me was reading a magazine article about successful female entrepreneurs. The irony was almost too perfect. Here I was, being publicly humiliated by people who thought I couldn't handle basic adult responsibilities, while I possessed skills that most people couldn't even imagine. I could land a damaged aircraft on a carrier deck in rough seas. I could coordinate complex missions involving multiple aircraft and ground units. I could make life-or-death decisions in fractions of seconds. But I couldn't make my family see me clearly. That was the one mission I'd never been able to complete successfully. Looking back, I think that moment on the airplane was when I finally stopped trying. Not consciously, I didn't make a deliberate decision to give up on earning their approval. But something inside me let go of the hope that things might change if I just tried harder or explained better or proved myself more completely. They were going to think what they wanted to think regardless of evidence. That wasn't a problem I could solve through better performance or clearer communication. It was a limitation they'd chosen, and I was done making it my responsibility to overcome. The freedom in that realization was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to care what they thought of me. I could just be who I actually was and let them deal with the consequences of their own assumptions. I had no idea how dramatically that shift in perspective was about to be tested. As the humiliation replayed in my mind, I stared out the window to steady myself. The Pacific stretched endlessly below us, a vast expanse of blue-black water that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. From this altitude, the ocean looked deceptively calm, its surface smooth as glass. But I knew better. Down there, currents were shifting, storms were brewing, forces were at work that could reshape coastlines and alter weather patterns thousands of miles away. I thought about the years I'd spent pushing past their doubts, the nights in simulators running emergency scenarios until my responses became automatic. The deployments where I'd proven myself over and over again, not to earn recognition, but because lives depended on precision. The countless hours of training that had transformed me from the uncertain girl they remembered into someone I was still learning to recognize. My father's voice kept echoing in my head, "She's useless. She can't do anything right." The casual cruelty of it was what hurt most. Not anger or disappointment, which would have suggested I mattered enough to evoke strong emotions. Just dismissive certainty, the kind of judgment you pass on something you've already written off. The strange thing was how normal this felt to them. My mother had already returned to her crossword puzzle. My brother was scrolling through his phone, probably texting friends about the awkward family moment he'd just witnessed. My father was reading the airline magazine with the satisfied expression of someone who'd successfully made his point. They'd humiliated me in front of strangers and moved on as if it were just another part of the flight experience. I watched a flight attendant walk past, checking seatbelts and collecting empty cups with practiced efficiency. She caught my eye for a moment and offered a professional smile, the kind that acknowledged difficulty without getting involved. I wondered what she thought of our family drama, whether she'd heard enough of these confrontations to recognize the patterns, whether she felt sorry for me or just wished we'd keep our dysfunction to ourselves. The airplane felt smaller than when we'd taken off, like the air was getting thinner despite the pressurization systems. I could hear every sound more acutely, the hum of engines, the whisper of air conditioning, the quiet conversations of other passengers who were having normal family trips without public humiliation as entertainment. A baby started crying somewhere behind us, that particular sound that cuts through everything else and demands attention. The mother's voice followed, soft and soothing, trying to comfort her child. It was such a normal sound, such an ordinary moment of care and attention, that it made my chest tighten with something I couldn't quite name. When had my family stopped trying to comfort me when I was hurting? When had they decided that my pain was less important than their need to be right about my inadequacy? I couldn't remember a specific moment when things shifted, just a gradual erosion of empathy that left us here, trapped together in a metal tube above the Pacific, performing the same tired roles we'd been playing for decades. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through messages from colleagues, updates from friends I'd made during deployments, photos from people whose respect I'd earned through demonstrated competence rather than family obligation. It was like looking at evidence of a parallel universe where I was valued for what I could actually do rather than dismissed for who they needed me to be. One message was from my squadron leader, asking about my next assignment, whether I was interested in a training position that would mean more responsibility and better opportunities for advancement. It was the kind of career development most people in my field would jump at, recognition of abilities that had been tested under real-world conditions. I stared at the message and felt the disconnect between my two lives more acutely than ever. In one world, I was someone worth promoting, someone whose judgment was trusted with expensive equipment and dangerous missions. In the other, I was someone who couldn't be trusted to pack correctly for a vacation. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable. I'd spent so many years compartmentalizing, keeping these two versions of myself separate, that I'd almost convinced myself they were both true somehow. But sitting there, feeling the weight of my family's collective disdain while holding evidence of professional recognition in my hands, I realized that only one of these stories could be accurate. Either I was the incompetent person they saw, or I was the capable professional my colleagues knew. Either their assessment was correct, or their assessment was irrelevant. There wasn't a middle ground where both versions could coexist without destroying something fundamental about my sense of self. I looked at my father, who was circling restaurant recommendations in the in-flight magazine with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. He was a good man in many ways, responsible, hardworking, committed to providing for his family. But he'd never been able to see me clearly, and I was beginning to understand that this wasn't a failing I could fix through better communication or improved performance. Some people are limited by their own assumptions, imprisoned by stories they've told themselves for so long that contradictory evidence becomes invisible. My father needed me to be the disappointing daughter because it confirmed his understanding of how families work, how success is distributed, how people like him differ from people like me. Revising that assessment would require him to question too many other assumptions about himself and the world. My mother was similar but different. Her dismissal of me felt more protective than malicious, like she was trying to shield me from expectations I might not be able to meet. But the result was the same, a systematic underestimation of my abilities that had shaped decades of family interaction. My brother was perhaps the most honest in his cruelty. He needed me to fail because my success would diminish his specialness as the family achiever. It was a zero-sum game in his mind, where my competence would somehow reduce his worth. So he'd become invested in my inadequacy in ways that were both obvious and unconscious. The airplane hit another patch of minor turbulence, just enough to make our drinks shift in their holders. I felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft adjusting to changing air currents, the subtle movements that kept us stable despite forces trying to knock us off course. It was a perfect metaphor for what I'd been doing my entire adult life, constantly adjusting, constantly compensating, constantly working to maintain equilibrium in the face of destabilizing forces. But I was tired of being the one who always adjusted. Tired of shrinking myself to fit their expectations, tired of pretending their assessment of my abilities was accurate, tired of protecting their feelings at the expense of my own dignity. The silence between us stretched on, filled with the white noise of air travel and the comfortable murmur of other families having normal conversations. I realized that their laughter said more about them than it ever could about me. People who were genuinely secure in their own accomplishments didn't need to diminish others to feel successful. People who were truly confident didn't require an audience for their superiority. Their need to humiliate me publicly revealed something ugly about their own insecurities, their own fears about whether they were as successful as they pretended to be. I was useful to them as a contrast, proof that they were the functional members of the family, the ones who had figured out how to live successfully in the world. But I was done being useful to them in that way. I was done being their cautionary tale, their example of what not to become, their reassurance that they were better than someone. If they needed to feel superior, they'd have to find another source of validation. The Pacific continued to stretch endlessly beneath us, unmarked by boundaries or landmarks, holding secrets in its depths that would never be fully understood. Like most large systems, it operated according to principles that were invisible from the surface, but absolutely fundamental to its functioning. I was beginning to understand that families operated the same way. The visible dynamics were often less important than the hidden currents underneath, the unspoken agreements about who got to be what, who was allowed to succeed, who had to carry the burden of everyone else's need to feel adequate. For 30 years, I'd been carrying that burden without fully recognizing its weight. Now I could feel it lifting, not all at once but gradually, like pressure equalizing after a long descent. The freedom was dizzying and frightening and absolutely necessary. I had no way of knowing that in just a few minutes, everything would change completely. That the assumptions and roles and careful family dynamics we'd all invested in would become irrelevant in the face of actual crisis. That I would finally have the opportunity to show them exactly who I was, not through words or explanations, but through actions that would speak more clearly than any conversation we'd ever had. But for now, I just sat quietly and watched the ocean pass beneath us, feeling something shift inside me that couldn't be shifted back. Whatever happened next, I was done pretending to be smaller than I was. Then came the jolt. One moment we were flying smoothly through clear skies. The next moment the entire aircraft was shaking like it was coming apart at the seams. The initial impact threw me against my seatbelt hard enough to leave bruises, and the sound that followed was unlike anything I'd ever heard on a commercial flight, a grinding, tearing noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The cabin lights flickered. Oxygen masks dropped from their compartments with a series of sharp pops that sounded like gunfire in the sudden chaos. Around us, passengers were screaming, their voices rising above the mechanical shrieking of damaged systems and rushing air. I looked out the window and saw what everyone else was seeing but couldn't quite process. The left engine was gone. Not just damaged or smoking, completely absent, leaving behind a ragged hole in the wing where thousands of pounds of machinery had been ripped away by forces I could only imagine. Flames were trailing behind us, bright orange against the blue sky, and pieces of debris were spinning away into the empty air. My family's reactions were immediate and predictable. My mother grabbed my father's arm and started praying in a high, panicked voice. My brother went pale and fumbled for his phone, as if calling someone could somehow fix what was happening 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. My father sat frozen, his face drained of color, staring at the oxygen mask dangling in front of him like he'd never seen one before. Around us, the cabin had erupted into chaos. Passengers were screaming, crying, clutching each other with the desperate intensity of people who suddenly understood they might be about to die. The flight attendants were trying to restore order, moving through the aisles with practiced efficiency despite their own obvious fear, helping people with their oxygen masks and attempting to calm the panic that was spreading through the cabin like a contagion. But I felt something else entirely. As the airplane shuddered and bucked around us, as alarms sounded from the cockpit and the smell of smoke began to filter through the cabin air, I experienced a strange kind of clarity. The fear was there. Anyone who wasn't afraid in that situation would have been clinically insane, but underneath the fear was something familiar, the calm that comes when training takes over from thinking. I'd been in emergency situations before. Not exactly like this one, but close enough that my mind automatically began running through procedures, assessing options, calculating possibilities. While everyone else was processing the emotional reality of imminent disaster, I was already thinking about solutions. The aircraft was still flying, which meant we had some control. The right engine was still functioning, which meant we had some power. We were losing altitude, but not in an uncontrolled dive, which meant the pilots were managing the emergency with whatever control surfaces were still responding. These were good signs, indicators that survival was possible if the right decisions were made quickly enough. But the screaming from the cockpit suggested that the right decisions might not be getting made. Through the open cabin door, I could see one of the pilots slumped over his controls while the other struggled with what appeared to be a catastrophic system failure. The aircraft was yawing to the left, fighting the asymmetric thrust that was trying to flip us over, and the pilot, who was still conscious, was clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the emergency. "We're going to die," my mother whispered, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "Oh God, we're all going to die." My father reached for her hand, his own trembling visibly. For the first time in my life, I saw him looking genuinely helpless, stripped of the confidence and authority that had defined him in my mind for as long as I could remember. My brother was hyperventilating, the oxygen mask sliding off his face as he gasped for air. They were looking at me now, all of them, with expressions I'd never seen before. Not the usual dismissal or casual contempt, but something desperate and pleading. As if they suddenly remembered that I existed, that I might have some kind of answer to what was happening to us. "Do something," my brother said, his voice cracking with panic. "You're in the military. You must know what to do." The irony was so sharp it was almost funny. 5 minutes ago, I was useless, incompetent, someone who couldn't be trusted with basic responsibilities. Now, faced with actual life-threatening crisis, they were turning to me for salvation. The same person they'd spent the last hour humiliating was suddenly their best hope for survival. But I didn't say any of that. There wasn't time for recriminations or "I told you so" moments. The aircraft was in serious trouble, people were going to die if someone didn't act quickly, and I might be the only person on board with the training and experience necessary to prevent a complete disaster. I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up, moving toward the aisle with the kind of steady purpose that comes from years of emergency training. Around me, passengers were still screaming and crying, but I tuned them out the way I'd learned to tune out distractions during combat missions. Focus on what mattered. Ignore everything else. A flight attendant tried to stop me. "Sir, you need to return to your seat and put on your oxygen mask." "I'm a pilot," I said, loud enough for her to hear me over the chaos. "Fighter pilot. I need to get to the cockpit." She looked at me with the kind of desperate hope that people cling to in impossible situations. "Can you help them?" "I can try." She stepped aside, and I moved forward through the cabin, past rows of terrified passengers who were clutching their oxygen masks and each other with equal desperation. The aircraft was still shaking, still losing altitude, but it was flying. That was the important thing. As long as it was flying, there was hope. The cockpit door was open, probably because the crew had been too busy dealing with the emergency to worry about security protocols. I could see both pilots now, one unconscious, possibly from hitting his head during the initial impact, the other wrestling with controls that were barely responding to his inputs. "I'm a pilot," I called out as I approached. "Military. I can help." The conscious pilot looked back at me with eyes wide with relief and desperation. "Thank God. I can't hold it much longer. We lost the left engine completely, hydraulics are failing, and Jim is unconscious. I don't know if we can make it to land." I stepped into the cockpit and took in the situation at a glance. Every instinct I developed over years of training told me that this aircraft was on the edge of complete catastrophic failure. But it was still flying, still responding to some degree to pilot input, which meant there was still a chance. For the first time in my life, I was going to show my family exactly who I really was. Not through words or explanations, but through actions that would speak more clearly than any conversation we'd ever had. I moved toward the pilot's seat, steady and calm despite the chaos erupting around us, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete certainty about my own capabilities. Whatever happened next, there would be no more questions about whether I could handle responsibility. I moved toward the cockpit with the kind of steady purpose that comes from years of training under pressure. The conscious pilot looked back at me with desperate relief when I identified myself, his face streaked with sweat and tension. Behind me, I could hear my family calling out, their voices barely audible above the mechanical screaming of damaged systems and the terrified cries of other passengers. "What's the situation?" I asked, sliding into the seat beside him while quickly assessing the instrument panel. "Complete engine failure on the left side," he said, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We lost it about 3 minutes ago. No warning, just gone. Hydraulics are failing, we're losing cabin pressure, and I can't get Jim to respond." He gestured toward the unconscious pilot. I've never dealt with anything like this in a commercial aircraft. I looked at the instrument readings and felt my training take over completely. The situation was bad, worse than bad, but it wasn't hopeless. The right engine was still generating power, which meant we had thrust and electrical systems. The aircraft was responding to control inputs, even if sluggishly. We were losing altitude steadily, but not in an uncontrolled dive. "What's our fuel status?" I asked, already scanning the gauges. "About 2 hours remaining, but I don't think we have 2 hours. The hydraulic systems are failing, which means we're going to lose control surfaces. And we're still over the Pacific. Nearest airport is at least an hour away." I checked our position on the navigation display. We were roughly halfway between the mainland and Hawaii, which meant we had limited options for emergency landing sites. But there were options, and that was what mattered. "Have you declared an emergency with air traffic control?" "Yes, they're vectoring us toward the nearest suitable airport, but good. Keep them informed of our status changes. I'm going to help you stabilize this aircraft." The pilot, his name tag read Captain Morrison, nodded with the kind of desperate trust that people place in potential saviors when they have no other choices. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep flying. I'm going to work on the engine and hydraulic problems." I'd flown different aircraft than this commercial airliner, but the fundamental principles were the same. Power, lift, control, and navigation, the 4 basic requirements for keeping any aircraft in the sky. We had power from the remaining engine, we had lift as long as we maintained airspeed, and we had enough control to keep flying level. Navigation was just a matter of getting to the nearest runway before something else failed catastrophically. The hydraulic failure was the most serious immediate problem. Without hydraulic pressure, we'd lose the ability to control the aircraft's flight surfaces, the rudder, elevators, and ailerons that kept us stable and steerable. But most modern aircraft had backup systems, redundancies built in for exactly this kind of emergency. "Try switching to the auxiliary hydraulic system," I suggested, pointing to the appropriate controls. Morrison's hands were shaking as he made the adjustment, but the results were immediate. The aircraft's response to control inputs improved noticeably, and several warning lights on the instrument panel switched from red to amber. "That's better," he said, relief evident in his voice. "How did you know to do that?" "Emergency procedures. We drill this stuff constantly in military training. Different aircraft, same principles." Behind us, I could hear the flight attendants working to calm the passengers, their professional voices cutting through the chaos with practiced authority. The screaming had died down somewhat, replaced by a tense murmur of prayers and whispered conversations. People were beginning to process what was happening, moving from pure panic toward the kind of grim determination that emerges when survival becomes the only priority. I checked the unconscious pilot's pulse, steady but weak, and made sure his airway was clear. He'd taken a significant blow to the head during the initial emergency, probably when the aircraft lurched from the engine failure. He needed medical attention, but that would have to wait until we were safely on the ground. "What's our descent rate?" I asked. Morrison checked the altimeter. "About 800 feet per minute. We're at 31,000 now." That gave us roughly 38 minutes before we'd be forced to attempt a water landing, assuming we couldn't find a runway. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. We needed to cover a lot of distance in a limited amount of time with a damaged aircraft that was gradually losing its ability to fly. "What airports are within range?" "Air traffic control is vectoring us toward an emergency field about 200 miles southeast of our current position. It's a military airstrip, long enough to handle commercial aircraft, but the approach is going to be challenging even under normal conditions." I knew the field he was talking about. I'd landed there before during training exercises. The runway was adequate, but it was surrounded by mountainous terrain that made the approach tricky even for experienced military pilots. In a damaged commercial airliner with failing systems, it would be like threading a needle while blindfolded. But it was possible. Difficult, dangerous, with a significant probability of failure, but possible. And possible was infinitely better than the alternative. "I can get us there," I said, "and mend it." Morrison looked at me with the kind of assessment that pilots give each other when lives are on the line. Whatever he saw in my expression seemed to reassure him. "What do you need?" "I need to take primary controls. You handle communications with air traffic control and monitor the engine status. If anything changes with our power situation, let me know immediately." He nodded and began making the transition, his hands steady now that he had someone sharing the burden of decision-making. As I took control of the aircraft, I felt the familiar sensation of connection between pilot and machine, the subtle feedback through the controls that told me exactly how the aircraft was responding to my inputs. The airplane was hurt, but it was still flying. The asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine wanted to pull us into a left turn, but I could compensate with rudder pressure. The reduced hydraulic pressure made the controls heavy, but they were still responsive enough for precise flying. We were losing altitude, but gradually and under control. I began a shallow turn toward the emergency airfield, feeling the aircraft's response through my hands and feet. Every vibration, every small change in the engine note, every shift in the instrument readings became part of my awareness. This was what I'd been trained for, not this exact situation, but situations where technical knowledge and calm decision-making were the only things standing between survival and disaster. Through the cockpit windows, I could see the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly in every direction, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. If we couldn't make it to the airfield, that water would be our only option for an emergency landing. Commercial aircraft weren't designed for water landings, and the survival rate for ocean crashes was depressingly low. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Not to the hundreds of passengers behind me, not to the crew who were depending on me, and not to my family who were finally seeing me for who I really was. Air traffic control wants to know our passenger count and fuel remaining, Morrison said. Tell them we have approximately 340 souls on board and about 90 minutes of fuel. And tell them we're going to need emergency services standing by: fire, rescue, medical. As he relayed the information, I continued the careful descent toward the emergency airfield. Every minute that passed brought us closer to safety, but also closer to the point where our remaining systems might fail completely. It was a race against time and physics, and the margin for error was shrinking with each passing moment. Behind me, I could hear my family's voices among the general murmur of passenger conversation. They weren't screaming anymore, weren't demanding that someone else fix their problem. They were watching me work, seeing me handle responsibility under pressure, witnessing competence they'd never believed I possessed. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 30 years, they'd told me I was useless, incompetent, unable to handle important responsibilities. Now their lives depended on abilities they'd never acknowledged, skills they'd never bothered to ask about, competence they'd systematically dismissed. But I wasn't flying this aircraft to prove them wrong or to earn their belated respect. I was flying it because people needed help, and I had the training and experience to provide that help. That was what mattered, not family dynamics or personal vindication, but the simple fact that I could do something others couldn't do, and doing it might save lives. The emergency airfield appeared on the navigation display as a small icon, still more than 100 miles away. Close enough to be a realistic goal, far enough away to require sustained concentration and careful resource management. I began calculating approach speeds and landing distances, factoring in our reduced control authority and the uncertainty of how the damaged aircraft would handle during the crucial final minutes of flight. "How are you feeling about this?" Morrison asked quietly. "I've had easier landings," I admitted. "But this aircraft wants to fly. As long as we don't lose the remaining engine or have a complete hydraulic failure, we can get down safely." He nodded, and I could see some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Having someone else share the burden of decision-making was allowing him to focus on his specific responsibilities instead of carrying the weight of everyone's survival alone. That was what competent people did for each other. They shared burdens, contributed their expertise, worked together to solve problems that no individual could handle alone. It was a lesson my family had never learned, too invested in their individual superiority to understand the value of collaboration. But they were learning it now, whether they realized it or not. They were depending on me in a way they never had before, trusting me with responsibility they'd never believed I could handle. The shift in our relationship was subtle but fundamental, and it was happening 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean in a damaged aircraft racing against time toward an uncertain landing. I adjusted our heading slightly and continued the descent, monitoring every system, every gauge, every indication that might tell me how much more the aircraft could endure. Behind me, hundreds of people were trusting me to get them safely back to the ground. including my family, who were finally seeing me exactly as I was. When the wheels finally screeched onto the emergency strip 43 minutes later, after an approach that required every bit of skill I'd developed over years of training, the cabin erupted in applause and tears of relief. We'd made it. Against significant odds, with failing systems and damaged aircraft, we'd made it safely back to solid ground. But the landing was just the beginning of a much larger change that had started the moment I stood up from my seat and walked toward the cockpit. My family's understanding of who I was had been shattered as completely as the aircraft's engine, and what would emerge from that wreckage was going to be very different from what had existed before. As I helped Morrison shut down the systems and prepare for evacuation, I could hear my family's voices behind me, calling my name with a mixture of relief and something else I couldn't quite identify. For the first time in my adult life, they were seeing me clearly. And what they saw was someone who could handle responsibility when it mattered most. The emergency vehicles were already surrounding the aircraft, firefighters and paramedics and rescue personnel ready to deal with whatever problems emerged from our damaged landing. Through the cockpit windows, I could see news crews setting up their equipment, preparing to document what would undoubtedly become a major story about a successful emergency landing. But all of that was secondary to the fundamental shift that had occurred during those crucial minutes when training overcame family dysfunction, when competence mattered more than preconceptions, when the person they dismissed as useless became the person everyone depended on for survival. My family would never call me useless again. Not because I demanded their respect or proven them wrong through argument, but because I demonstrated capabilities they couldn't ignore or dismiss. Actions, as it turned out, really did speak louder than words. And for the first time in 30 years, I was looking forward to our next family conversation. When the wheels finally screeched onto the emergency strip, the cabin erupted in relief and celebration. Passengers who had been certain they were going to die were suddenly faced with the overwhelming reality of survival. The sound of applause mixed with tears and laughter and prayers of gratitude created a wall of noise that seemed to physically press against the aircraft's walls. But I remained focused on the immediate tasks that would ensure everyone got off the aircraft safely. The landing had been successful, but we weren't completely out of danger yet. The damaged systems that had gotten us this far might still fail catastrophically, and with emergency vehicles surrounding the plane, fuel leaks or electrical problems could create new hazards. "Nice work," Captain Morrison said, his voice steady now that we were safely on the ground. "I've never seen anyone handle a situation like that so calmly." "Just training," I replied, but I could hear the pride in my own voice. Not arrogance, pride. There was a difference, and for the first time in my life with my family, I didn't feel the need to minimize my accomplishments or deflect recognition of my abilities. The evacuation began with the practiced efficiency that comes from extensive crew training and regular emergency drills. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, helping passengers gather essential belongings and directing them toward the exits in order of priority. The elderly and families with children went first, then everyone else in orderly rows. I stayed in the cockpit until the medical team arrived to take care of Jim, the unconscious pilot. He was stirring now, conscious, but clearly disoriented, asking questions about what had happened and where we were. The paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher with the kind of careful attention that suggested his injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. As I finally prepared to leave the cockpit, I could see my family in the aisle, moving slowly toward the exit with the other passengers. They kept looking back toward the front of the aircraft, trying to see what I was doing, their faces showing a mixture of relief and something else I was still learning to recognize. It wasn't quite respect, that would take time to develop, but it was the beginning of respect. The first crack in 30 years of assumptions about who I was and what I was capable of. They had witnessed something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as luck or accident. They had seen competence under pressure, decision-making in crisis, skills they hadn't known I possessed. The evacuation was proceeding smoothly, which was what mattered most. Every passenger who walked off that aircraft alive was a small victory, proof that the emergency procedures had worked, that training and preparation and calm decision-making could triumph over catastrophic mechanical failure. I gathered the essential paperwork and prepared to leave the cockpit. As I stepped into the cabin, I could see that most of the passengers had already evacuated, leaving behind only a few stragglers and the crew members who were doing final safety checks. The aircraft felt eerily quiet after the chaos of the last hour, like a building after everyone has gone home for the night. My family was waiting for me near the exit door. They'd stayed behind while other passengers evacuated, which surprised me. I'd expected them to be among the first people off the aircraft, eager to get away from the scene of potential disaster. Instead, they were standing together in a small group, watching me approach with expressions I'd never seen before. "Are you okay?" my mother asked, and I could hear genuine concern in her voice. Not the performative worry she usually displayed when she wanted to appear caring, but actual anxiety about my well-being. "I'm fine," I said. "How about you? How's everyone feeling?" "We're okay," my father said quietly. "Thanks to you." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to explore. This was uncharted territory for our family, a situation where I had been the competent one, the person who solved the problem, the one whose abilities had mattered most when everything was on the line. "I can't believe you knew how to do that," my brother said, and for once there was no mockery in his voice. "I mean, I knew you were in the Air Force, but I never realized. I never understood what that meant." "Most people don't," I replied. "It's not something that comes up in normal conversation." But even as I said it, I realized that wasn't entirely true. It hadn't come up in our conversations because I'd learned not to bring it up, learned that talking about my military experience made them uncomfortable, challenged their assumptions about family hierarchy and success. I'd made myself smaller to accommodate their need to feel larger. That was going to change now. Not dramatically, not with confrontations or demands for recognition, but gradually and fundamentally. I was done pretending to be less capable than I was, done protecting their egos at the expense of my own dignity. "We need to get off the aircraft," I said. "The emergency crews need to secure the scene." We moved toward the exit together, passing through the door where a flight attendant was waiting to assist passengers down the inflatable slide that had been deployed for the evacuation. It was surreal to be leaving the aircraft this way after what we'd just experienced, like waking up from a dream that had been part nightmare and part revelation. The emergency crews were waiting at the bottom of the slide with blankets and bottles of water, treating everyone like survivors of a traumatic experience rather than passengers who had simply arrived at an unexpected destination. Which, I supposed, was exactly what we were. News crews were setting up their equipment at a respectful distance, preparing to document what would undoubtedly become a major story. I could already imagine the headlines: "Hero pilot saves commercial flight," "Emergency landing prevents disaster," "Military training saves 340 lives." The kind of recognition that I'd never sought, but that felt strangely satisfying after years of having my abilities dismissed. My family stayed close to me as we moved through the crowd of passengers and emergency personnel. They seemed uncertain about how to behave, like actors who had suddenly found themselves in a play where the script had changed mid-performance. The roles they were used to playing, the successful parents and the achieving brother contrasted with the disappointing daughter, no longer made sense in light of what they'd witnessed. "Will there be an investigation?" my mother asked. "Probably. The FAA investigates all serious incidents involving commercial aircraft. They'll want to know exactly what happened and why the engine failed." "Will they want to talk to you?" "Almost certainly. I was acting pilot in command for the emergency landing. They'll want a detailed account of the procedures we followed and the decisions we made." She nodded, but I could see her processing the implications of what I was saying. Her daughter, the one she'd spent years telling people couldn't handle responsibility, was going to be interviewed by federal investigators about her role in preventing a major aviation disaster. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming. A reporter approached us, recognizing that we were passengers from the aircraft and hoping for interviews. "Excuse me, could I ask you a few questions about your experience during the emergency?" "She's the one you want to talk to," my father said, pointing at me. "She's the pilot who saved us all." The reporter's attention shifted immediately, her professional instincts recognizing a much bigger story than passenger reactions. "You're the pilot who assisted with the emergency landing?" "I helped, yes. Can you tell me about your background? What kind of training prepared you for a situation like this? I could feel my family listening to my answers with the kind of attention they'd never paid to anything I'd said before. As I explained my military service, my combat experience, my years of emergency training, I watched their faces change. They were hearing details about my life that they'd never bothered to ask about, learning about accomplishments they'd never acknowledged. For 30 years, they'd constructed a story about who I was that served their psychological needs, but had almost nothing to do with reality. Now reality was asserting itself in ways they couldn't ignore or dismiss. The competent person being interviewed by reporters, the pilot who had helped save hundreds of lives, the woman being praised by aviation professionals, that was their daughter, their sister, the family member they'd spent decades calling useless. The interview concluded with the reporter asking for my contact information for follow-up questions. As she walked away, my family and I stood together in the afternoon sunshine, surrounded by emergency vehicles and news crews and the organized chaos of disaster response. "I'm sorry," my mother said quietly. The words were so unexpected that I wasn't sure I'd heard them correctly. "What?" I said, "I'm sorry. For what we said on the plane. For what we've been saying for years. We were wrong." My father nodded, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. "We didn't know. We didn't understand what you were capable of." "You never asked," I said, not harshly but honestly. "You never wanted to know." "No," he agreed. "We didn't. And that's on us, not on you." My brother was the last to speak, his voice barely audible above the noise of the emergency response. "I've been jealous of you my whole life, and I never even knew what I was jealous of." It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and probably the most honest thing he'd ever said to anyone. The recognition that his need to diminish me had been driven by his own insecurities rather than my inadequacies was a revelation that would change our relationship in ways we were only beginning to understand. "We have a lot to talk about," I said. "But not here, not now. Let's just focus on getting home safely." They nodded, and for the first time in decades, I felt like we were actually a family rather than a group of people connected only by shared genetics and mutual obligation. Not a perfect family. There were too many years of damage to repair overnight, but a family that might be capable of growth and change and honest communication. The balance had shifted permanently. They could never again call me useless, never again dismiss my capabilities, never again treat me like the family disappointment. They had seen me at my best when everything was at stake, and that kind of revelation couldn't be undone. More importantly, I had seen myself clearly for perhaps the first time. Not through their eyes or in reaction to their expectations, but as I actually was competent, skilled, capable of handling responsibility when it mattered most. That self-knowledge was worth more than any apology or recognition they could offer. We walked together toward the buses that would take us to the terminal, leaving behind the damaged aircraft that had become the site of our family's transformation. Behind us, investigators were already beginning their preliminary examination of the wreckage, trying to understand exactly what had gone wrong and how disaster had been averted. But I already knew the answer to their most important question. Disaster had been averted because when it mattered most, competence had triumphed over assumptions, training had overcome family dysfunction, and actions had spoken louder than 30 years of words. That was a lesson none of us would ever forget. Later, as we walked off the tarmac together, my family's voices had changed completely. The sharp edges of dismissal and casual cruelty had been replaced by something softer, more tentative. They were speaking to me the way people speak to someone they're still learning to know, someone whose capabilities have surprised them in fundamental ways. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been on that plane," my mother said as we waited for the bus that would take us to the terminal. "Someone else would have helped," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. The specific combination of training and experience that had allowed me to assist Captain Morrison wasn't common among commercial airline passengers. "But what if there hadn't been someone else?" she pressed. "What if you'd been the only person who could have handled that situation?" It was a question I'd been avoiding thinking about, but she was right to ask it. If I hadn't been on that flight, if I hadn't had the training and experience necessary to assist with the emergency landing, the outcome might have been very different. Hundreds of lives had potentially depended on capabilities my family had spent decades dismissing as irrelevant. I try not to think about what-if scenarios, I said. What matters is what actually happened. But privately, I was beginning to understand the full implications of what had occurred. Not just the successful emergency landing, but the complete reversal of family dynamics that had defined our relationships for 3 decades. The person they'd called useless had become the person everyone depended on when survival was at stake. The irony was almost overwhelming. For years, I'd wanted their recognition, their acknowledgement of my abilities, their respect for what I'd accomplished in my military career. I'd imagined scenarios where they would finally see me clearly, where they would apologize for their dismissive treatment and acknowledge their mistakes. Now that it had actually happened, it felt different than I'd expected. Less satisfying, more complicated. Because I could see how much their revelation was costing them, how difficult it was for them to confront the fact that they'd been fundamentally wrong about someone they'd known their entire lives. My father was particularly struggling with the adjustment. He kept looking at me sideways, as if I were a puzzle he was trying to solve. The daughter he thought he knew, the disappointing one who couldn't handle basic responsibilities, had been replaced by someone who could land damaged aircraft under emergency conditions. The cognitive dissonance was visible in every interaction. "How long have you been able to fly like that?" he asked as we boarded the bus. "Military pilots train for emergency situations constantly," I said. "But every situation is different. You never know exactly what you'll be capable of until you're tested. But you knew you could do it? When you saw what was happening, you knew you could help." I thought about that for a moment. I knew I had training and experience that might be relevant. Whether it would be enough, that was something I could only find out by trying. He nodded, but I could tell he was still processing the implications. His daughter had walked into a life-threatening emergency and calmly taken control of a situation that was overwhelming trained commercial pilots. That level of competence under pressure wasn't something that developed overnight or by accident. My brother was handling the adjustment differently. Instead of trying to understand how I developed abilities he'd never recognized, he was focused on his own reaction to the crisis. "I completely panicked," he admitted. "When I saw that engine explode, I thought we were all going to die, and I just froze. I couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't do anything useful." "That's a normal response to a life-threatening situation," I said. "Most people aren't trained for emergency scenarios. There's no reason you should have known how to react. But you did know. You stayed calm, you took action, you helped save everyone. That's not normal." He was right, of course. The ability to remain functional under extreme stress, to think clearly when everything is falling apart, to take effective action when lives are at stake, those weren't normal capabilities. They were the result of years of specialized training designed to produce specific responses to crisis situations. But I'd never been able to explain that to them before because they'd never been interested in understanding what my military service actually involved. They dismissed it as an extended phase I was going through, something I would eventually outgrow when I decided to get a real job. Now they were beginning to understand that what they'd seen as a temporary deviation from normal life had actually been the development of capabilities they couldn't imagine possessing themselves. The daughter they'd underestimated had been learning skills that most people never needed, but that became invaluable when everything went wrong at once. "I think I've been jealous of the wrong things," my brother continued. "I've spent years being proud that I make more money than you, that I have a bigger house and a better car. But when it really mattered, when people's lives were on the line, none of that meant anything. You were the one who could actually help." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it was happening on a bus full of airplane crash survivors being transported to an emergency terminal in the middle of nowhere. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me, but it also felt exactly right somehow. Crisis had a way of stripping away the superficial layers of relationships and revealing what was actually important underneath. My mother was quieter than usual, lost in her own thoughts about what she'd witnessed. Finally, she turned to me with the kind of direct question she'd never asked before. "What else don't we know about you?" It was a simple question that opened up possibilities for conversation we'd never had. For the first time in my adult life, she was asking about my experiences rather than making assumptions about them. She wanted to know who I actually was instead of insisting on who she thought I should be. A lot, I said honestly. There's a lot you don't know. Will you tell us? Not right now, but when we get home. Will you help us understand what your life has actually been like? I looked at her carefully, trying to assess whether this was genuine curiosity or just a temporary reaction to dramatic circumstances. But what I saw in her expression was something I'd never seen before, real interest in me as a person rather than as a family role that needed to be managed. Yes, I said. I'd like that. The bus pulled up to the terminal, where airline representatives were waiting to help us with rebooking and hotel arrangements. The immediate crisis was over, but the practical complications of having our flight end at an emergency airstrip in the middle of nowhere were just beginning. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to deal with the logistics of getting home, I realized that the most important change wasn't in how my family saw me. It was in how I saw myself. For the first time in decades, I didn't need their approval to feel confident in my own abilities. I knew what I was capable of because I'd proven it when it mattered most. That self-knowledge was liberating in ways I was still discovering. I was done making myself smaller to accommodate their assumptions. Done protecting their feelings at the expense of my own dignity. Done accepting their assessment of my worth instead of trusting my own experience. The balance had shifted permanently, and there was no going back to the old dynamics that had defined our relationships for so long. They could never again dismiss me as the family disappointment, and I would never again accept that role even if they tried to assign it to me. We walked into the terminal together, but we weren't the same family that had boarded the flight to Hawaii that morning. We were something new, something that would need to be negotiated and redefined through honest conversation and mutual recognition of who we all actually were. For the first time in my life, I was looking forward to that process. The lesson was simple. Sometimes, the only way to silence doubt is not with words, but with proof written in action. I'd spent 30 years trying to explain myself to people who weren't interested in understanding. In the end, it had taken a crisis to show them what I'd always known about myself, that I was capable of far more than they'd ever imagined. Now, finally, they knew it too. And more importantly, I knew that their knowledge or ignorance of my capabilities didn't define me. I defined me through the choices I made and the actions I took when everything was on the line. That was a truth no family dysfunction could ever change, and no amount of dismissal could ever diminish. It was mine, earned through experience and proven under pressure, and it would remain true regardless of what anyone else thought or said or believed. The plane to Hawaii had become something much more important, the place where I stopped being who they thought I was and started being exactly who I'd always been. The difference was that now everyone could see it clearly, including me. That flight changed everything for me and for my family. The same people who once called me useless now know exactly who I am. But more importantly, I know it too. Have you ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, only to prove them wrong when it mattered most? How did it feel when the truth finally came out? And if you've ever carried other people's doubts on your shoulders, what did it take for you to finally set them down? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this resonated with you, hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs the reminder. You're capable of far more than people may believe.